Yes, it was a Red Bull 1-2. Max Verstappen, Sergio Perez, absolutely brilliant all day in Bahrain. But Fernando Alonso and Aston Martin, the absolute stars, finishing third. They'd been really quick all weekend. As I said on Friday, back in Maranello, the message would have been, we are slower right now than Aston Martin. Of course, Ferrari out-qualified Fernando Alonso, and to some extent, I think that changed the texture of the build-up. Many people thought, yeah, well, looking pretty good in FP1, FP2, FP3, but when it comes down to it, Ferrari's still very quick. Well, the reality is, had Fernando Alonso actually qualified, I think, at the capability of the Aston Martin, he could have qualified third, fourth, and he may have got much nearer to the Red Bulls, certainly to Sergio Perez, than he did actually in the race. On race day, Fernando just stunning. Shame about the qualifying lap because the car was just covered with grip to the point where back end of the race, Fernando got on the radio, and we don't hear this very often, but good to hear it, saying, this car is just lovely to drive. You don't hear racing drivers saying that very often. Usually there's a complaint somewhere, but Fernando is a race driver with race in italics, of course. And on race day, that brings out the best in him. And there are all sorts of situations in which he was just mighty. Difficult to say the best part of Fernando's drive. Was it the George Russell pass? Was it the Lewis-Hamilton battle? Yes, it probably was that. They're on the last stint now, and they're all on hard tyres. And Fernando's got a lot more grip than the Mercedes, no question about that. But Lewis doing a really good job. He's looking after his tyres. He's managing the tyres as best as he can. And they get to turn 4 at the end of the straight, and Fernando's got the run on Lewis. Lewis stays to the inside. Fernando's on the outside. It's an easy pass to do there once you're in that position. Well, relatively easy anyway. But Lewis just goes back and retakes the position. Just brilliant work by Lewis Hamilton. I think that really, however, put Fernando in another mode, because you could just see then the adrenaline pumping. There is no way in the world I'm not going to beat Lewis Hamilton in this Grand Prix. And then, to my astonishment, I have to say, Fernando got him at turn 9 through that kink where Lewis is absolutely brilliant, braking for 10. And it wasn't because he forced Lewis into a mistake and he locked up an inside front, ran wide, which is exactly what Fernando would do to Carlos Sainz a few laps later. No, this was Lewis going through turn 9 thinking, yeah, I've got him now, I'm through turn 9. And Fernando just suddenly bang down the inside using all the additional grip that the Aston Martin had at that point. And I think if you want any testament as to how good that car is, it was that millisecond of the Grand Prix when Fernando was just able to go bang like that, flick the steering, and straight inside Lewis Hamilton as they brake for turn 10. And after that, I think Lewis was a bit gobsmacked, and he tried to stay with him for a little bit, but no way in the world. Within about a lap, Fernando was pulling away at half a second a lap, which is a lot. And if you are now Toto Wolff, talking to the Mercedes board, explaining to them how your customer team is now blowing you away by half a second a lap in the back stages of the Bahrain Grand Prix. Well, I'm glad it's Toto Wolff doing that and not I, because that was not a great race for Mercedes by any means. And it was multiplied by Lance Stroll beating George Russell. Another great pass as well by Lance Stroll. George Russell, we're talking here, one of the racer's racer. And Lance Stroll, just fabulous as well. Damaged hands, in pain, all that stuff, drove really well. Just underlining how good that car is. I hope I'm not going to say it was this weekend in Bahrain. Let's hope that this continues throughout the year. There's no reason why it shouldn't, because for the Aston Martin to be this good, this is all about aero efficiency. And if you've got aero efficiency, you've basically got a race car. As Fernando said, it's a lovely car to drive. Just to reiterate the point, shame he didn't go slightly better in qualifying, but nonetheless, the message eventually came through, because guess what happened? Charles Leclerc sitting pretty for an easy third place, blown away by Red Bull, but nonetheless doing what Ferrari and Charles does pretty well, making the best of the situation, heading for third place. Suddenly ground to a halt, back end of the race, no power. Ferrari. The one thing that they needed to find, well, two things they needed to find, was obviously tyre management and grip, and then reliability after what happened in 2022. And we just assumed, did we not, that Maranello would be right on top of the reliability of this car, this new car. And alone, really. I mean, there was a lot of McLaren dramas. Piastri retired with some sort of electrical drama, and there were a few other issues. But generally speaking, reliability was really strong up and down the field. And here's Charles Leclerc in the Ferrari, heading for third place, no power, just pulls off the side of the road. You know, that is just appalling, really, at this stage of the regulations with the power unit, and that they should have that sort of problem. And what a loss for them. Carlos Sainz did a pretty good job to defend as long as he could, and he beat Lewis Hamilton to the finish. You could say that, but both of them were basically a second a lap slower than Fernando by the end of the race. So these were two slow cars trying to manage their tyres to the end of the race. Sainz did a good job under pressure from Lewis, finished fourth. But the story, of course, was Fernando Alonso's third place for Aston. None of that should really detract from the job that Max Verstappen did today. Very few issues, very clean start. He was pulling away second a lap virtually from the start of the race. He did have a problem 1/3 into the race when he got on the radio to say that on downshifts he was starting to lock the rear. They gave him a new strategy to run. That seemed to cure it. It wasn't perfect, but you know, Max isn't going to be troubled by something like that. Sergio Perez, really good job. He didn't make a great start, had to do a bit of work to get up to second place, but Red Bull did that very well. They ran both their cars soft, hard. Everybody else went soft, hard, which I think is testament, of the quick runners, which I think is testament to how good that Red Bull was. And I suppose the other thing you could say is that now that they know they have a quick car, and if this was race 5, for example, probably Aston would have done the same thing. They probably would have run soft, hard as well, like Red Bull. And had they done that, and had Fernando done a slightly better job in qualifying, then I think, they could have been right there. And we can look forward to that, I think, for the rest of the year. Not every circuit, obviously, but certainly the pace at Bahrain will not go away in the upcoming races, and very, very good to see. Mercedes, dismal, really. They've had all winter to think about the problems. More than that, they've had the fall of last year and the winter to think about their problems with 2022, and they haven't really come up with an improved car. In fact, you could argue that it is worse because they're now slower than Aston Martin. They're still behind Ferrari patently, and they're obviously still behind Red Bull. And if you look at the margins, they're exactly the same difference from the pole. Nothing has really changed in 12 months. So for Mercedes, this is a real shock, I would have thought. And as I said at the time, and as I've said in some of the videos just over the weekend, I think that win by George Russell in the Brazilian Grand Prix flattered to deceive and possibly led them down some paths that they're now regretting, because that win was all about Red Bull getting their ride heights completely wrong on a sprint weekend when they could do nothing about it. It wasn't necessarily about Mercedes who got this leaked, as we can now see. And as we saw in Bahrain, it was a very, very difficult day for both Lewis and George Russell. I suppose from Lewis's point of view, he drove really well. Very good fight with Fernando. It's the first time I can ever recall Lewis being caught asleep. Is that the right word? Unawares? Perhaps is a better word, on a corner like turn 9. And he'll be taking that with him, I think, away from this race, thinking, Lewis, come on, what are you doing? This was not the Lewis Hamilton that we've known ever since 2007, but nonetheless, he did some other great work in the car today, and of course, he did beat George Russell off the line and headed him throughout the race. Even if early on, George a little bit precociously, I think, got on the radio when he was behind Lewis saying, Lewis is holding me up. Is he struggling? Is he just slow? And they came back on the radio and said, no, Lewis is struggling, which didn't actually prove to be the case, because he started to pull away from George then. And by the time they got to the first pit stops, he had actually pulled away a couple of seconds from George. So I'm not quite sure what that was all about. That was just an indication of the sort of needle that's there. Not one-on-one, eye-to-eye needle. This is in the race car needle. And as I made the point, particularly over the winter, if the Mercedes was the Red Bull this year, super, super quick, and vying for the championship, you can't even begin to imagine what would be going on between George and Lewis, the fight that would be going on. Nonetheless, it isn't, and at the moment, they're not even as quick as Aston Martin, as I say. Other results, Lance Stroll, as I say, very good to finish P6. George Russell was 7th. Valtteri Bottas, very good drive by Valtteri to finish 8th. Effectively best of the rest. We can take Aston Martin out there because they're no longer the rest. So Valtteri, good job. And Pierre Gasly, from the back of the grid, that horrendous qualifying he had yesterday, P9 in the Alpine, making up for a disastrous day for Esteban Ocon, his teammate, who had something like 5 or 4 penalties. Every time he came from a penalty, then it would be track limits, then it would be speed limit in the pit lane, then it would be something else. Just ridiculous. ridiculous day, and eventually he retired. And Alex Albon drove really well too, as did Logan Sargent, I think, the two Williams drivers. Alex finished 10th and Logan Sargent finished 12th, and he was up there mixing it with Lando Norris whenever he had a chance, doing really well. Yuki Tsunoda 11th in the AlphaTauri, also pretty good in a car that's obviously not brilliant. Haas had a sort of up and down day. Kevin Magnussen 13th. And as for McLaren, just a terrible weekend for both drivers, for both Lando and Oscar Piastri, who was one of the retirements, and Lando going round and round and round, but not really in it at any stage, and a sufficient number of problems for it to be a real worry for McLaren at this stage. So, I take away from this race, we shouldn't forget the brilliance of Red Bull, the way they ran all their compounds through long runs, incredible reliability, incredible consistency between both drivers. Max Verstappen just on it from the beginning of qualifying. Certainly wasn't on Friday, but the beginning of qualifying through to the end of the race. Sergio Perez right there, ready to pick up any slack if there was any problem with Max. And then Fernando Alonso in a car that is not far away from the Red Bull, I would say. In a car not far away from the Red Bull, making up for a slightly disappointing qualifying with the sort of driving that has become his trademark over the years. It begins just as the lights go out. No, probably on formation lap it begins with Fernando. The race weekend begins for him on the formation lap. Forget Friday and Saturday, it's all boring. That's when he comes alive, and that's when this amazing racing driver takes over an event. He's bigger than the event in reality. And at this age, he's been around a long time, at this age, still driving absolutely as well as he's ever done. He may not be perfect in terms of one lap, but in terms of putting a race together and just using his sheer animal competitive nature to catch the car in front and to psych them out and to create passes that others never think about, then Fernando Alonso's your man. And what he did to Lewis Hamilton today at turn 9, well, I won't forget that for a long time, and I doubt that Lewis will forget it either, because there are plenty of ways that Lewis could have got past by a quicker car at Bahrain. It could have been under braking at the end of the main straight in front of the pits, just let everybody know that he hasn't got as much grip of the Aston. It could have been into maybe even turn 11 back straight. You could say, oh yeah, well, he got the run, traction was better. But through 9 into 10, that was just unbelievable. So I say to Fernando Alonso, absolutely stunning. You really earned that third place behind the two Red Bulls. And that's what we will remember this Bahrain Grand Prix for. Just one of those drives that will always stick in the mind. Thanks for watching. We'll be back again, of course, with our 3 videos from the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix weekend. And between now and then, we'll be doing other videos, and I'll be doing some live streams as well. So watch out for notifications. See you soon.